Well, Kevin Smith is once again embarrassing himself over Masters of the Universe Revelation. This time he's embarrassing himself over part 2. Let's check it out. If you're tired of what these people are doing to pop culture, if you're tired of what people like Kevin Smith are doing to shows and IPs like Masters of the Universe, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I try to post multiple times a day on this channel. Let's get into the video. So if you remember back whenever I was making videos, and a lot of other people were making videos as well, but back whenever Masters of the Universe Revelations Part 1 came out, Kevin Smith was non-stop tweeting about the show. He was non-stop talking about how the show's getting review bombed and stuff like that. People are botting the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. All that BS that he was saying, all the BS that they all say whenever their shows and movies do bad. They always claim review bombing, they always claim bots and stuff like that. It's never possible that you could possibly make a bad movie or a bad TV show. That is never going to be the case. They'll never admit that. They either, blame it on istophobes or they blame it on bots and review bombing. That's just how it works. That's how they save face, and that's how they get more projects. That's how they get more work in the future. That's what Kevin Smith is trying to do exactly with this tweet right here. Kevin Smith tweets this, I believe it was yesterday, November 27th. So yeah, yesterday or 2 days ago. Means the world, or rather the universe. My likes are filled with love for Masters Official, and it was for part 1 as well, because of course there's always going to be people who just like whatever Kevin Smith does just because it's Kevin Smith, or they're going to like whatever Masters of the Universe comes out with because they're not red pilled yet. They don't understand what's really happening. They don't understand what they're trying to do with these shows and the bait and switches that are being pulled. They just don't understand yet because, like I said, they're not red pilled yet, but hopefully they will be in the future. But he says, my likes are filled with love for Masters Official Revelation. After part 1, I had to wade through some bile to read positive reactions, but since part 2 dropped, the anger directed at me in July seems to have subsided. Fingers crossed for season 2. Now we'll get to that in 1 minute. Fingers crossed for season 2 is absolutely ridiculous. But let's first start off with, after part 1, I had to wade through some bile to read positive reaction. He still doesn't understand that he created the whole situation with Masters part 1. Now, no one else did that. It wasn't the fans who just randomly decided to hate on Masters of the Universe part 1. It was him that did it. He was the one that was on Twitter attacking Clownfish TV for getting everything right. He was straight up lying about them. He was disparaging their name and their YouTube channel and stuff like that. He was disparaging their sources, and they got it completely right. He was the one that was on Twitter lying. He was the one on Twitter, and he was the one that created the show, obviously, where they baited and switched the whole fan base. Where, I'm not a big He-Man fan, but whenever I saw the trailer, whenever I saw the I Need a Hero trailer, I was like, damn, I really want to check this show out. It looks like He-Man is going to be front and center in the show. Even in this picture that he posts right here, He-Man is front and center. Never in this show, in part 1 or part 2, is He-Man front and center. It's absolutely ridiculous. But when I saw that trailer, I was like, damn, I want to check this show out. It looks like He-Man's going to be doing some pretty cool stuff in this. It looks like just a cool, fun show to turn your brain off and enjoy it. But it wasn't the case. Of course, they have to pull a bait and switch where He-Man isn't really the main character. In part 1, it was Teela. In part 2, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm not going to go into too many spoilers in case someone out there does want to watch the show. I have nothing against you if you do like the show. I have nothing against you if you want to check the show out. Go ahead, check it out, enjoy the show. I envy you for being able to enjoy this show. But in part 1, Teela was the main character, and in part 2, go check it out for yourself. But once again, He-Man was not the main character. It's absolutely ridiculous that they continue even after part 2 is already out. Part 2 is already watched by everyone who's going to watch it. They continue to post pictures like this. They continue to market the show like this. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then whenever he says he has to read through some bile for part 1, but since part 2 dropped, the anger directed at him seems to have subsided. It's not that the anger subsided because the show is really good. It's just the fact that everyone gave up on your show after part 1 because it was so horrible. The only people who stayed around for part 2, the only people who actually watched part 2 of the show are people who absolutely loved part 1 somehow. People, like I said, those Kevin Smith stans who just love everything Kevin Smith puts out, or those people who haven't been red pilled yet and absolutely loved part 1. That's the only people who watched part 2, because we're not just gonna keep hate watching your stuff. That's not healthy, that's not fun behavior. It's not fun for me to watch Masters of the Universe part 2 after I already know what they did in part 1. It's not gonna be a good part 2, so of course we're not gonna stick around and watch part 2, or most people won't stick around and watch part 2 because part 1 was so bad. So the only people who are going to be leaving reviews, the only people, well, actually that's not even true. The only people who are going to be tweeting at you are the people who loved part 1. So of course there's going to be less backlash for part 2 when there's way less people watching the show. Let's check out some of the Rotten Tomatoes scores for part 1 and part 2, since he said that the hate has subsided, all the dislike for the show has subsided. 90% critic score for part 1 and 45% audience score. pretty bad, but it's even doctored. You know, it was only around 20% for audience score. Then they doctored it up all the way to 45%. That's actually pretty crazy, because I know that they bumped it up to 35%, and then they froze the reviews, so you couldn't even leave any reviews. It looks like now they doctored it up to 45% from around 20%. But here is part 2. Where has the hate subsided? Only 8 critic ratings, and it's 88%. And then 564 audience score, 51%. You can't even see the number of audience score for part 1 for some reason. I wonder why that would be. But for 51% for audience score, that doesn't mean that the dislike for the show has subsided in any way. That's just people aren't tweeting at you as much because, like I said, the passion for the show, the people who are still sticking around watching the show either just aren't that passionate about it like they were for part 1. Like, you know, people for part 1 were very hyped for the show, extremely hyped for the show, and very passionate He-Man fans watching the show. For part 2, it's probably just a little bit less passionate fans, a little bit, you know, a lot less hype for the show in general. And the people just aren't that hurt by part 2 because they were already hurt enough by part 1 where they just expected it for part 2. So they went and left their review and they moved on instead of tweeting at you to change it, because I think they just kind of accepted defeat and they were like, you know what, this show's a lost cause, let's just move on to the next one. But the Rotten Tomatoes score says totally differently from what Kevin Smith says in this tweet. You know, the positive is not all positive like he says. And then a lot of people are out there saying that they're just leaving bad reviews because the show's not made for them. It's made for little kids and all this stuff, which for one just isn't true. Even Kevin Smith himself said that this is made for the old He-Man fans, you know, the fans of the OG He-Man content, which also isn't true. But it's definitely not true that we're just leaving bad reviews because, or I didn't leave a review, but those people out there are leaving bad reviews because it's just a kids show and not made for them. Because check this out. He-Man Masters of the Universe Season 1 got 77% and 80% critic score. So this show was actually made for kids and has a Fortnite-style animation, and it got a 77% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. So that's definitely not the case. It's definitely not just an age thing where people just don't like Masters of the Universe Revelations because it's a He-Man show, because for one, it's not a He-Man show, but for two, adults can still enjoy stuff that's not specifically made for adults. But Kevin Smith himself said that this show is made for the old He-Man fans. This show is made for adults, according to Kevin Smith. I don't know if that's true. I mean, it's definitely not made for kids. If you watch some of the content that's in part 2, they have some very adult themes and very adult themes within part 2. It's actually kind of crazy how adult they got with the show. So it's definitely not made for kids. So that argument is just stupid all around, because even if it was made for kids, like you see right here, I guarantee you kids aren't leaving these reviews. Kids aren't leaving reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So it's not just for kids. This is for everyone. It's just a poorly made show. It's just Kevin Smith baiting and switching once again. It's Kevin Smith lying to the fans once again. And I mean, hopefully part 2 doesn't happen, but it's kind of embarrassing that he's begging for part 2. He's begging Netflix for part 2. Hopefully that never happens, because I don't want to see these He-Man fans hurt any more than they've already been hurt. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about this whole situation. What do you think about Kevin Smith lying to the fans once again and saying the hate has subsided for Masters Part 2? Let me know what you think about the whole situation in the comments. If you did enjoy this video though, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to follow me on Twitter, link to that in the description as well. Thanks for watching the video. Hope to see you next one.